On October 25th, 1957, Albert Anastasia sat down in a barber's chair on 7th Avenue in Manhattan. He did not get up. On December 16th, 1985, Paul Castellano stepped out of a black Lincoln Town car outside Sparks Steakhouse on East 46th Street. He was dead before he reached the sidewalk. On July 12th, 1979, Carmine Galante was eating lunch in the garden of a Brooklyn restaurant called Joe and Mary's. He never finished his meal. The history of Italian-American organized crime is a history of violent exits, assassination, federal prison, death on the witness stand. For most of the men who rose to power in the American underworld, the only question was how, not whether, the end would come by somebody else's hand or somebody else's indictment. But not all of them. A handful of men ran their organizations for decades, accumulating power, directing criminal operations that the federal government documented in thousands of pages of indictments and RICO prosecutions, and still managed to die in their own beds of old age, in their own homes. The federal government came for them. Grand juries convened. Wiretaps ran for years. Senate committees named them publicly on national television, and they outlived all of it. Tonight, on the Commission Files, we count down 5 mob bosses by every documented measure, got away with everything, and died the way most men only hope to, in bed, at home, of natural causes. The sources for this episode are drawn from Selwyn Rabe's 5 Families, Anthony DeStefano's Boss biographies, the Senate McClellan Committee hearing transcripts of 1963, Gus Russo's The Outfit, the FBI's FOIA released surveillance files on each figure named, and the federal case records of the major RICO prosecutions. 5 names, 5 lives, 5 natural deaths. Let's begin. Number 5, Carlo Gambino, born in Caccamo, Sicily, on August 24, 1902. Arrived in the United States illegally in 1921 aboard a cargo ship. Died on October 15, 1976, of a heart attack at his home in Massapequa, Long Island. He was 74 years old. He died watching television. According to Selwyn Rabe's 5 Families, Gambino rose from a low-level associate of the Mangano family in the 1930s to become the most powerful organized crime figure in the United States by the mid-1960s. He accomplished this without a single federal conviction, not because the government didn't try, because he was, as Rabe documents, the most careful and the most patient boss in the history of the 5 Families. The FBI opened a sustained surveillance file on Carlo Gambino in the early 1950s. The file ran for decades. Agents tailed him in cars. They photographed him at restaurants, at funerals, at weddings. They documented his meetings with bosses from every family in New York and from outfits across the country. And the FOIA released surveillance files make this frustration explicit, was catch him saying anything incriminating, directing any specific criminal act, or appearing anywhere near the actual execution of the conduct his organization was engaged in. Gambino ran the largest and most profitable organized crime family in American history through a system of insulation that the FBI, in its own files, described as nearly impenetrable. He communicated in person. He kept no records. He used intermediaries for every layer of command. He gave no speeches, held no press conferences, and never once allowed himself to be photographed willingly. The federal government's most serious attempt to bring a criminal case against Gambino came in connection with the 1972 kidnapping of Frank Sinatra Jr., a case in which Gambino's nephew had peripheral involvement. Gambino cooperated with investigators, testified before a grand jury, and walked out of the federal building without charges. As DeStefano documents in his biography of the Gambino family, the FBI agents who spent years building a case against Carlo Gambino were, by the mid-1970s, beginning to acknowledge internally that they might not reach him before he died. They didn't. On the morning of October 15th, 1976, Carlo Gambino suffered a heart attack at the breakfast table in his home in Massapequa. He had spent the previous day, by the accounts of family members documented in subsequent press coverage, watching baseball on television. He died, according to the attending physician, of arteriosclerotic heart disease. No federal case had ever been completed against him. The family he had built, which the FBI estimated controlled the largest share of organized crime revenues in the United States, passed to his cousin, Paul Castellano, whom Gambino designated in a handwritten document that was notably never contested. The FBI had spent 25 years on him. He died at home watching television. Number 4. Anthony Joseph Accardo, born in Chicago on April 28, 1906, to Sicilian immigrant parents. Known in the FBI files as Joe Batters, known in the press as Big Tuna, died on May 22, 1992, of congestive heart failure, at his home in Barrington Hills, Illinois. He was 86 years old. Gus Russo, in his definitive history, The Outfit, documents what he calls the most remarkable fact in the history of American organized crime. Tony Accardo spent more than 50 years at or near the apex of the Chicago Outfit, one of the most powerful and violent criminal organizations in the United States, and he was arrested only twice. He spent a combined total of 0 nights in federal prison. He was tried for federal income tax evasion in 1960 and acquitted, and he was, by the FBI's own documented assessment, the most effective outfit leader since Al Capone. Accardo became a trusted figure in the Capone organization in the late 1920s. He allegedly earned the nickname Joe Batters from Capone himself, after demonstrating a particular proficiency with a baseball bat at a 1929 dinner. That event is documented in FBI files, but the specifics of the allegation are from a single source and remain disputed by historians. What is not disputed, and is established in the FBI's FOIA files and in Senate hearing testimony, is that Accardo rose steadily through the outfit through the 1930s, took operational control in the late 1940s, and maintained a position of final authority over outfit affairs for the next 4 decades, even when he nominally stepped aside to put other names in front of him. This was Accardo's singular genius. As Russo documents in The Outfit, Accardo understood that visibility was death. He watched Paul Ricca get deported. He watched Frank Nitti collapse under federal pressure and take his own life. He watched what happened to bosses who let themselves be seen, named, photographed, and documented in connection with specific operations. Accardo's response was to make himself simultaneously indispensable and invisible. The FBI ran sustained surveillance on Accardo for decades. The FOIA files fill multiple archive boxes. They document his movements, his associates, his real estate, his finances. They document that he was present at organized crime meetings at the highest level and that he maintained authority over the outfit's core operations, the gambling networks, the union influence, the Las Vegas casino relationships, long after other bosses would have been indicted. What the FBI could not do was build a case that would hold. The 1960 income tax case ended in acquittal. Grand juries were convened, witnesses were identified, and then those witnesses, on multiple documented occasions, as the FBI files reflect, declined to testify, relocated, or died before they could appear in court. Tony Accardo retired for practical purposes in the early 1980s. He moved between his home in Barrington Hills and a condominium in Palm Springs, California. In 1977, burglars broke into his Chicago residence while he was in Florida. Within weeks, every one of the burglars involved was dead. The FBI investigated. No charges were ever brought against Accardo in connection with the deaths. He died on May 22, 1992, of congestive heart failure. He had lived 86 years. He had spent 0 nights in federal prison. Number 3. Meyer Lansky, born Meyer Sucholyansky in Grodno, then part of the Russian Empire, on July 4, 1902. Arrived in New York as a child, died on January 15, 1983, of lung cancer at Mount Sinai Medical Center in Miami Beach, Florida. He was 80 years old. Lansky's position in the history of American organized crime is unique. He was not a boss in the traditional sense. He held no official rank within any of the 5 families. He was never formally inducted into any Mafia family because he was not of Italian descent. What he was, as documented in the Senate McClellan Committee hearings of 1963 and in the FBI's surveillance files spanning 4 decades, was the primary financial architect of the National Crime Syndicate, the coordinating body that Luciano established in 1931 to manage relationships across organized crime families nationwide. According to Robert Lacey's Little Man, the definitive biography of Lansky, and corroborated by FBI surveillance files released under an FOIA, Lansky's role was to move money. He built the casino operations in Havana in the 1940s and 1950s with Santo Traficante and Fulgencio Batista's cooperation. He managed the skim from Las Vegas casino operations that the FBI spent 20 years trying to document and prosecute. He developed offshore banking relationships in Switzerland and the Bahamas that the federal government, by its own documented admission, could never fully trace. The FBI called him the chairman of the board of the underworld. That description appears in FBI File 9, released under FOIA. It is not hyperbole. It is the Bureau's own operational assessment, written by agents who spent years trying to build a case against him. They tried. For decades, they tried. The most serious federal effort to prosecute Lansky came in 1970, when the Justice Department indicted him on charges of skimming casino profits from a Las Vegas hotel. Lansky fled to Israel and attempted to claim citizenship under the law of return. The Israeli Supreme Court ruled against him in 1972, and he was forced to return to the United States. He was indicted, he was tried, and in 1974, the jury acquitted him on all counts. The government's key witnesses had credibility problems. The financial paper trail, the one Lansky had spent 40 years deliberately obscuring, could not be reconstructed to the standard required for conviction. Meyer Lansky died of lung cancer on January 15, 1983, at Mount Sinai Medical Center in Miami Beach. The Justice Department had spent the better part of 4 decades investigating him. They had estimated, in internal documents that were later made public, that he controlled or had access to personal assets of between $300 million and $400 million in the early 1970s, an estimate that Lansky himself, when asked by journalists, dismissed with the famous line that has been repeated in every biography since, "I'm worth more than I can spend." He died in a hospital bed of natural causes at 80 years old. The government never collected a dollar. Number 2, Francesco Castiglia, known to the world as Frank Costello, born in Loro-Poli, Calabria, Italy, on January 26, 1891. Arrived in New York as a child, died on February 18, 1973, of a heart attack at Doctors Hospital in New York City. He was 81 years old. Frank Costello is the most important figure in the history of the Genovese family that most people have never heard of properly. He was not the most violent boss in the history of the American Mafia. He was not the wealthiest. He was the most politically connected, the most institutionally embedded, and, as Selwyn Reid documents in 5 Families, the closest to making organized crime a permanent, legitimized feature of the American political landscape. The federal government, the state of New York, and 2 separate Senate investigating committees all came for him. He survived everything except a bullet from his own organization that didn't kill him. Costello rose to prominence through the Prohibition era, building bootlegging networks across the Northeast in alliance with Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky. After Prohibition, as documented in 5 Families, he pivoted to slot machine operations, working arrangements with Huey Long's political machine in Louisiana, and to the systematic cultivation of relationships with judges, politicians, and law enforcement officials throughout New York and beyond. The FBI's file on Costello, released under FOIA, documents his meetings with officials at nearly every level of city and state government. Some of those officials were later removed from office. None of them were federally prosecuted in connection with their documented contact with Costello. The federal government's most significant confrontation with Frank Costello came in 1951, When Senator Estes Kefauver's special committee to investigate crime in interstate commerce called him to testify in nationally televised hearings, Costello agreed to testify but refused to allow his face to be shown on camera, citing an eye condition. The television cameras, in one of the most striking broadcasts in early American television history, showed only Costello's hands turning, pressing together, and tapping on the table, while his voice responded to questions. 20 to 30 million Americans watched. He was convicted of contempt of Congress for walking out of the hearings before they concluded. He served 11 months. He was later convicted on federal income tax evasion charges and served a portion of that sentence as well. These were the only federal convictions ever entered against him. On May 2nd, 1957, Vincent Gigante, acting on orders that the FBI would spend years documenting but could never fully prove originated with Vito Genovese, shot Frank Costello in the lobby of his apartment building at 115 Central Park West. The bullet grazed Costello's skull. Costello survived. When police asked him who had shot him, he told them he had not seen his attacker. Gigante was arrested and tried. Costello refused to identify him. Gigante was acquitted. Costello stepped down as boss of the Genovese family in 1957, after the Anastasia hit made clear that remaining in his position was no longer safe. He lived quietly in New York for the next 15 years. He was described by FBI surveillance reports from the 1960s as living essentially the life of a retired businessman, lunching at good restaurants, attending social functions, maintaining his social connections. Frank Costello died of a heart attack on February 18, 1973, at Doctors Hospital in New York. He was 81 years old. He had been shot in the head and survived. He had appeared before 2 Senate committees. He had been convicted twice on relatively minor charges, and he had spent his prime years as the most politically connected, organized crime boss in American history. Connections that neither federal prosecutors nor Senate investigators were ever able to convert into a major criminal conviction. Number 1. Giuseppe Bonanno, born in Castellammare del Golfo, Sicily, on January 18, 1905, came to the United States in 1924 after fleeing Mussolini's fascist campaign against the Sicilian Mafia. Died on May 11, 2002, at St. Mary's Hospital in Tucson, Arizona. He was 97 years old. Joe Bonanno, as the press called him, a nickname he detested, is the most remarkable case in the history of American organized crime. He was one of the founding members of the National Commission, the governing body of the American Mafia that Lucky Luciano established in 1931 after the Castellammarese War. He was named publicly before the Senate as one of the most powerful organized crime figures in America. He survived an internal mob war that bore his name. He was kidnapped by his own commission. He disappeared for 19 months. And then he retired to Tucson, Arizona, wrote a memoir, gave media interviews, and lived to 97 years old. The FBI's surveillance file on Joe Bonanno is, by the Bureau's own documentation, one of the longest-running organized crime surveillance operations in American history. As RAB documents in 5 families, the FBI opened its file on Bonanno in the 1950s and maintained active investigation of him for decades. They documented his meetings, his communications, his movements across the country and internationally. What they could not do was build a federal criminal case against him that would survive. The most significant federal confrontation with Bonanno came in 1963, when the McClellan Committee named him publicly as one of the major bosses of the American Mafia, based in part on the testimony of Joseph Valachi, the first made member of the Cosa Nostra to publicly describe its structure under oath. Bonanno was summoned before a federal grand jury. On October 21, 1964, on his way to testify, he disappeared. His attorney informed the court that his client had been kidnapped. The FBI investigated. 19 months later, on May 17, 1966, Joe Bonanno reappeared in a federal courthouse in Manhattan. What happened in those 19 months has never been fully established in the public record. The FBI's FOIA files contain multiple theories and conflicting informant reports. What is documented is that while Bonanno was gone, a war broke out within his family, later called the Banana War, between factions loyal to him and factions that had aligned with the Commission's decision to remove him from power. That war lasted, in various forms, until approximately 1969. Bonanno himself was indicted in 1980 on charges of obstruction of justice in connection with testimony he had given before a grand jury investigating the family. He was convicted in 1981 at the age of 76 and sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. He served 14 months before being released on medical grounds. That was the sum total of his federal convictions. 1 obstruction charge, 14 months served. For a man who had been one of the founding architects of American organized crime, who had sat on the original commission in 1931, who had run one of the 5 families for more than 3 decades, and who had, according to the FBI's own documented assessments, overseen criminal operations spanning bootlegging, gambling, labor racketeering, and narcotics distribution. After his release from federal custody, Joe Bonanno retired permanently to Tucson. In 1983, he published a memoir titled A Man of Honor, the first, and to this day, the only autobiography by a sitting or former boss of a New York organized crime family. The memoir was a calculated document, as mob historians have noted. Bonanno acknowledged his role in the Mafia's structure and history, while carefully avoiding specific admissions that could expose him to additional prosecution. He gave interviews, he appeared in documentaries, he outlived most of his enemies, most of his allies, and most of the federal prosecutors who had spent careers trying to put him away. Joe Bonanno died on May 11, 2002, at St. Mary's Hospital in Tucson, Arizona. He was 97 years old. He died of heart failure. He had founded a family, survived a war that bore his name, written a memoir, outlived the century, and spent a combined total of 14 months in federal custody. Carlo Gambino, who ran the largest family in American organized crime for 19 years and died at home in Massapequa, watching television. Tony Accardo, who spent 50 years at the head of the Chicago outfit, was tried once, acquitted, and died at 86 in Barrington Hills. Meyer Lansky, the financial architect of the National Crime Syndicate, who was acquitted at trial and died in a Florida hospital at 80 years old. Frank Costello, the Prime Minister of the Underworld, who survived a bullet in the head and 2 Senate committees and died at 81 in a New York hospital. And Joe Bonanno, one of the founding members of the original commission in 1931, who wrote a memoir, outlived his prosecutors, and died at 97 in Tucson, Arizona. The documented record, the FBI files, the federal court transcripts, the Senate hearing testimonies, the historian accounts, tells a consistent story about how these men survived when others didn't. They were patient. They kept distance between themselves and the specific acts that their organizations carried out. They communicated carefully. They were, above all, disciplined in ways that the men who died violently often were not. What the documented record also tells is the cost to the people around them. The witnesses who were intimidated, the competitors who were eliminated, the victims of the criminal enterprises they built and operated, the federal investigation resources, hundreds of agents, dozens of prosecutors, decades of grand jury time that were consumed trying to reach them. These men did not get away with nothing. The record establishes clearly what they did and who paid for it. It bears acknowledging what the documented historical record is clear on. The men covered in this episode represented a small criminal minority within the Italian-American community of their era. The broader Italian-American community, the families that built this country, served in its wars, and shaped its cities, has nothing to do with the conduct documented in these files. The history of Italian-American organized crime is not the history of Italian Americans. It is the history of a criminal organization that exploited ethnic solidarity to protect itself, and that the federal government spent decades dismantling through the tools of RICO prosecution and cooperating witnesses. The organization is largely dismantled. The men in this episode are dead. The files are open. Organized crime built its empire in the dark. Federal prosecutors and historians spent decades dragging it into the light. The Commission files exists to document what they found, not to glorify it, not to bury it, but to remember it. New episode next Tuesday. Sources for everything covered tonight are in the description. This has been The Commission Files. Good night from the archive.